Welcome to the Science to People podcast, where we turn cutting-edge health and science insights into information that's discoverable, understandable, and actionable. I'm your host, Brinleigh Murphy-Reuter. If you caught a recent piece in the New York Times, you might have noticed our guest's name in an article discussing microplastics in our bodies. Dr. Marcus Garcia is on the team that reported microplastics in the human brain, about the amount of plastic that is found in a disposable spoon. Dr. Garcia is a PHRMA Foundation Fellow at the University of New Mexico College of Pharmacy, where he specializes in toxicology and pharmacology. He's developed innovative techniques to quantify microplastics in biological tissues, and has led projects ranging from placental exposure to neurological health. He earned his PharmD from UN 2020, completed a clinical research fellowship with Tricor Reference Laboratories, and joined UNM as a postdoctoral scholar in 2021. Wow, that's a lot of school. Through his work, Dr. Garcia aims to inform clinical practice and shape sustainable, science-driven solutions. Love that. But what does this all really mean for the rest of us? Let's find out. Dr. Garcia, welcome to the Science to People podcast. Dr. Marcus Garcia, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Brinleigh. Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you have been kind of all over recently with from a media perspective. People are really interested in your work right now.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, this has been a great experience, and I'm just thankful that we're able to get this research out there, kind of work to just really provide information for people, especially around microplastics, because this is still a very new field that not a lot of people have a lot of information on. And that's what we're really working towards, is being able to establish and continue to build upon the story that we've already been able to present, and really just bring an educational perspective into what's going on around micro and nanoplastics and what they're doing within our bodies as well.
Yeah, well, I'm super excited to learn more and to talk to you and ask you all of the questions that my friends asked me to ask you too. But before we get into all that, I think the first thing I normally ask my guests is this coffee shop question, right? We're waiting in line at a long coffee shop. I turn around and ask, what do you do? How would you describe your work?
So what I like to say is I'm a pharmacist by training. So I do bring in a lot of that clinical aspect into my research. But with all this research, I've really become more of a toxicologist, is what we like to say. So really focusing on studying on microplastics, how they're being distributed, or how they enter into the body, and then how they're being distributed throughout the body, and overall looking at what type of health outcomes are associated with that. So that's really what I do, and in the last couple of years have really been focusing on improving that knowledge, and really looking forward to continuing to build on what we've been able to establish up to this point.
Yeah, and these studies, and especially one recently, have really caught the public attention. Your team, your lab was written up in the New York Times. I saw it all over my TikTok and Instagram. So I'm curious, in an age where science information can really go viral, how do you ensure that the core of your research, the methods used, and what those methods and kind of outcomes can and can't tell us remain front and center in the public's interpretation or understanding of your work, rather than kind of overshadowed by a big headline like microplastics in the brain?
I think that that's a great question, and really sharing our findings is the biggest importance. I mean, we work to establish what we do know, as well as work to establish what we still don't know. So it's really wanting to focus on those different areas. And like I say, is with microplastic and nanoplastic research, there's still so much that we need to uncover. So we don't want to overshadow anything with a headline. We want to make sure that all the data that we're providing and the research that we're doing is really well established to be able to continue to move that forward, and really use that to educate the people within the community to make their own decisions. And also too, with anything, whenever there's the unknowns, we want to work to be able to uncover those. And I think that that's going to be the area that anybody going into microplastics research really needs to focus on is getting that information out into the community to be able to allow individuals to really establish what's really going on in our environment.
I think that's a very different take with this concept of looking at what you don't know or acknowledging what kind of the field doesn't know. I felt like since COVID, there's been such a need, at least in the public perception, for science to be really sure
Absolutely.
and really be able to defend the findings that they're putting out into the world. And that's hard in a burgeoning field. And so I'm curious kind of how yourself, your colleagues handle that, like how you handle this uncertainty in communicating that with the everyday person.
Yeah. So I will say that when establishing techniques that we're wanting to look at, it really starts with what has been done. A lot of microplastics research started within the marine environment. I mean, as we know, there's the Pacific Gyre that has these large plastic.
Sorry, marine environment.
So like our oceans.
The oceans.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just to kind of backtrack, so a lot of this started with studies in the oceans, just because we do know that there's a lot of plastic debris that's free floating in there. I mean, we've all heard about the garbage patch the size of Texas, right?
Or the turtles with the thingies around their neck from like Coke cans and stuff.
Exactly. So a lot of the
Yeah.
research started there and really focusing on the visualization of these plastics. Now that was initially where it started, and we wanted to work to improve on some of those steps, just because with that, like one, it's more of a visual perspective, but also two, we really were missing out on a lot of the plastic material, because when we talk about microplastics specifically, it's anything less than 5 millimeters in size. So when we look at that from a perspective, it's about the size of a grain of rice. Still,
Wow, that's really small.
yeah. So, but still able to see from the naked eye, right? Yeah. So those pieces of plastic material continue to break down into much smaller pieces that aren't always visible by the naked eye or need advanced microscopy techniques or using a microscope to be able to look at these things. But also too with technology such as like Raman spectroscopy or Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. So pretty much being able to use some laser technology to be able to shoot it at these particles, and then it brings back a signal saying this is polyethylene, this is polystyrene. Those are things that have been used in the past, and we still use those in our lab today. However, those are limited to about 5 micron in size. So still not as visible, but we're really missing the whole nanoplastics and the much smaller particles. So that's kind of the limitation with that technology right now. So that's where we wanted to answer that question. Well, what can we do to advance this and really capture a lot more of those smaller particles? So that's where a lot of the research that we do using the technique around pyrolysis gas chromatography, mass spectrometry comes into play. So we're able to use that to capture not only the nano and micro plastic materials, but use that technique to quantify the amounts that we're seeing, not only in the environment, but also, as we've seen with some of our newer publications, being able to use that to see how much is in biological tissues.
Wow. Okay, so you used a lot of words that sounded like they were in Star Wars, like nano something, spectrometers. Anything that has a spectrometer should be in like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids or something like that. Okay.
Right, right.
So this is big science. This is highly technical science. It's biology, it's environmental science, it's spectrometers. Basically, it's plastic in the body or plastic in the world, right? But like in the world, in the teeniest, tiniest amounts. How do you convey all of this to policymakers, healthcare folks,
Mhm.
much less like the New York Times or me,
Right,
in a way that like we can actually use to make a difference? How have
right,
you been doing that?
right. So I think that the biggest thing to say is whenever we look at like policy or looking at public health leaders, we really need to focus on the so what of it all. You know, I mean, we walk out every single day, and I have yet to see a day where I haven't found a piece of plastic on the ground. Or so, you get a little closer and you can even see some of these smaller materials breaking down. But, really, really using our platform and even as scientists to have those evidence-based takeaways just to help like with our public health leaders or policymakers to provide the information that may not otherwise be available in terms of micro and nanoplastics, and trying to break it down into more of a practical guidance on things to think about. So that's kind of the biggest area that we need to focus on. And it's not always the easiest thing in the world, but I think that it is the direction that we really want to focus on and continue to push forward. I mean, again, like I say, is you go outside every day and you can see how much plastic is already in our environment, and what can we do to not only limit it for ourselves, but also limit it for our environment as well, because at a certain point it's going to reach a threshold where it's going to be challenging to really handle all of these. And I'm talking about not only our plants, our soils, our wildlife, us, and that might not always be the best outcome, and hopefully we don't ever get to that.
Yeah. I'm worried we will, though, because in the article in the Times, there was a comparison in the study that your team did that you
Mhm.
found the same amount or relatively the same amount of plastic in human brains as a disposable plastic spoon. And I think that from a science communication perspective, like that is a very visceral comparison. Everybody knows what a plastic spoon is. And to think about breaking down all of those plastics and seeing them in my brain tissue really freaked a lot of people out. And so, how should we interpret that comparison? And what kind of key nuances do people need to understand?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that one of the big things to think about, and it is a scary number, and looking at it from that perspective. Now, I also want to make sure when we are talking about how much is in there, it's not like it's these big giant chunks. So like a lot of times you look at like a plastic spoon and people may think like these are bigger pieces. These are actually small nano materials that are to kind of give it an idea, the size of two COVID viruses. So very, very small pieces of plastic,
Wow.
well distributed throughout the brain.
Right.
And even in some of the studies that we're continuing to do, is we're actually looking to create a map of the entire brain region to be able to say like, is there more plastic in, say, the frontal cortex or the front portion of the brain versus like in the middle, the back? Because a lot of times that's going to help with educated discussions around like, is this leading to any type of health outcomes or things along those lines. Now, again, I do want to say that with a lot of our findings, this is very scary, but still, or I should say that these are scary numbers, but people are still living well into their 80s and 90s. There's still so much to uncover. Now, even within this study, we did see that there was even a higher proportion of plastic material in brain tissue from Alzheimer's patients. But we also want to say that this is more of a correlation at this point, not a causation. So saying that just because of the disease itself, it might allow for more material to get in. So these are areas that we still need to work and are continuing to work on heavily. So still don't want to scare people with these. We want to make sure that we're just bringing as much information to the table as we can. Even looking at this, just making sure that we're continuing to advance our techniques. Of course, doing a lot of analysis, even on some of the samples that we've been running before, being able to cut out any extra kind of interferences that may be going on or things along those lines too. So there's still a lot of things that we're doing and establishing to be able to add to the picture of what we've already been able to establish.
That's great because I do think it is It is scary. Like these findings and the ongoing research are alarming. It's not necessarily things that we don't know, right? Like intuitively, even. We've heard a lot about microplastics over the years. First, there was kind of the BPA scare, which I'm still not sure what that is or if it has anything to do with actual microplastics, but I know it's in things that are plastic. So, given all of that and the fact that I think the average person probably knows to avoid plastics, I guess, but it sits in this echelon of using glass, Tupperware instead of plastic, or refill a reusable water bottle so that or don't drink out of a water bottle that's been sitting in a hot car. Those are kind of the top plastic things that come to my mind. Then there was this Instagram targeting ad that I got that was talking about plastic cutting boards and trying to sell me cutting boards that weren't plastic, I guess. And it was showing a knife like scraping the board and showing all the little pieces of plastic coming off, which to your point are not nanoplastics, they're microplastics, perhaps, if at best of under 5 millimeters. So what can we do? Are those things that I just highlighted even good interventions? Are they worth it? I think I saw in your study that there was something about like the plastics that you were seeing are really super old.
Yes.
So is my water bottle effort worthless? Tell me.
So we're going to break this down into two main areas. So we're going to first start with the aged plastic perspective, and then we'll go back to the water bottle and the cutting boards perspective as well. So just to kind of talk about like aged plastics.
Are you saying age plastics?
Aged plastics, yes.
Aged plastics. Okay.
Yes.
Old plastics.
Yes.
Okay.
So just to kind of give a little bit of history around plastic production, it really started amplifying around the 1950s, and it doubles in production in about every 10 to 15 years. Well, within that, what we've noticed and what's been established is that as those plastic materials, once we're done using them, majority of the times like they end up in a landfill or they land up in our oceans, and they start to break down, whether that be from sunlight, so UV, I mean just the water degradation, even from like landfills when they're compacting it down, we call that mechanical degradation.
Degradation meaning like it's
Like breakdown.
degrading,
Yeah,
breaking down.
grading,
Okay.
breaking down into these smaller microplastics. So say you used a water bottle. Let's take for today, for example. So say you use a water bottle today, and then that ends up in a landfill. Now, over the next 20 to 30 years, that's going to continue breaking down into these smaller microplastic materials. And as they age, they become a little bit more fragile, so it can break down even faster than what we would see with fresh plastics. So then what ends up happening with those is that material can leach out into our groundwater, into our soils. And
Because it's so small and broken down. I'm thinking about like a really old Ziploc baggie that I might like find in a purse or something. Like it's thin, it might already have holes in it. Is that
but
the process you're talking about?
potential, yes. So in that context, but even like if you've had any plastic material or anything around the house for years, or I always think about like the old keyboards or things from like way back when. They started out as this white material, but then ultimately start to have like a yellow tinge, can kind of fall apart a little bit easier.
Get gray or rough, kind
Exactly.
of. Yeah.
That's the aging of these materials, right? So as those end up breaking down, like from a water bottle, these single-use plastics, Ziploc bags, they break down into these micro and nanoplastics, end up in our groundwater, and then into our soils. And what do we use those for majority of the time is for agriculture. So plants can actually absorb some of the microplastics as they're growing. Then our livestock consume that and it ultimately gets into their tissues. But then even when we use like manure for fertilizer, that is just a bioaccumulation because you use that to fertilize. So you're just adding more plastics to our food source. So that's been the biggest thing that we've been able to see. And we've also done studies around our food products and even being able to see that there's plastic present in our food, that's really where we're getting majority of our exposure to these microplastics and nanoplastics.
Wow, that's so different than what I thought you were going to say. Because I think that the kind of public version of this
Mhm.
is that it's in the products that we're using every day that we're getting it from. So, like, I have water in a plastic Brita filter downstairs, and I have been freaking out about getting a glass filter.
Right,
It's expensive. It's like
right,
$150 for a glass filter on Amazon, like one that actually looks nice. And my husband won't let me buy it because it's a $150 thing to hold water.
right.
But I'm freaking out about the Brita. What it sounds like is I don't necessarily need to be thinking about the Brita right now. I need to be thinking about what happens to the Brita after I've thrown it away.
Yes,
And
and
that Brita showing up like in my great grandchildren's
right,
brains.
right. So I think that 2 points. There's a yes, and I think that you're spot on with like what happens to that Brita once I'm done with it and it breaks down. Because yes, that will affect your grandchildren and potentially your great grandchildren. Absolutely. So that goes now and segues into the second portion of like, well, what about the water bottle now or the cutting board? The big thing is anytime we can limit our exposure to plastics, it's going to play an important role. Lessen the environment, especially like the single-use plastics. How many times have you gone to the grocery store and you'll see every single cucumber wrapped individually?
Cucumber condom. What is up with that?
Yeah. So those are things that we can like think about in ways to where we can prevent, because ultimately you're just gonna take that off and that goes in the trash or something along those lines. Also too, like with water bottles, any time that we can limit our use just to prevent more from being in the environment. But also too, I need to also make this statement where there's a lot of plastic products that are still very useful today. But like we look at medicine, for example. Without those products, like medicine wouldn't be able to advance the way that it has. So plastics do have a purpose. However, it's what we do with those plastics once we're done with them is where the problem arises. So that's where policymakers can really come into play. I mean, even people within industry just being a little bit more aware, trying to figure out how can we reuse some of these materials or produce something that may have less of these materials in them is going to be a very important role. And even trying to figure out if there's any way around infrastructures. Can we have waste to energy treatment plants? I mean, we see European countries using a lot of these and able to take a lot of that plastic waste and convert those into energy. And yes, it will be a big lift in terms of financial investment, but in a lot of ways it can be very beneficial. So these are a lot of the things that we're starting to think about. And I think that with a lot of the research that we're doing, we want to help establish what that correct way of being able to do these is going to be.
Okay. So I'm hearing single use plastics, no. Plastics that you've had for a long time, okay. To keep using it as long as you have it.
I mean, it really depends. Like, I mean, going back to the cutting board kind of scenario. I mean, if you want to use wood, that's good, but also comes with like how you properly clean
Food,
them and
yeah, foodborne illness. I heard I can't do my chicken on wood.
yeah, so there's so many things that still need to be uncovered. But like, when you're cutting and using that cutting board, if you're gonna cut a piece, it's actually gonna be much larger than like a microplastic. So our body has a good way of actually excreting that out of our bodies as we consume it. So that may not be as much of a challenge initially, but again, too, as you continue to use your cutting board and you start to see that one area of surface where it starts to turn kind of like a whiter or an opaque kind of color as compared to almost like a fresh, clean layer,
Yeah.
that's probably where it's starting to age, and those are things to think about. So it's hard to give a definitive answer. Like, we don't want to say absolutely cut off everything, but these are things in which you can work and incorporate into your daily lives to give yourself less of an exposure kind of outcome as well.
Okay, if I decide to get rid of that plastic Brita filter holding my water downstairs
Hmm.
and spring for the glass one, right?
Hmm.
Which it sounds like I maybe should.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, great. So, in case my husband is listening, Dr. Marcus Garcia, PharmD, RPH, says that we can buy the expensive glass water filter. Great. Thanks for the note. Then, so you're telling me, though, that right now, at least in the US, if I go to put that in either the recycling or the trash, that Brita water filter that I'm throwing out because I just bought a new glass one, that we don't currently have the processes in place to make sure that that plastic doesn't turn into
Hmm.
microplastics in our brains or in our kids' brains in the very far future, because right now our disposal systems don't support the proper kind of breakdown or reuse of those plastics. Is it recycling better than trashing it, or do we just not have the infrastructure here? And maybe that's what we should be advocating for at the
Right.
state level or the federal level.
Right. And I think that that's going to be the big thing, is like really that advocacy, and really having people understand these concepts even further to help with that decision making process. Now every state is different. I mean, I know we all have our recycling bin, we have our regular trash bin, but in a lot of ways it's actually gone well beyond that, just because there is so much already in the environment. So that's where I think that we all need to really come together to work to not only continue to create or establish better recycling opportunities from a state as well as national level, but also to like whatever's already in these landfills or in the environment, what are some things that we can do to potentially pull those out, and again, like establish policies around how to better manage those, get those out of the landfills that are still continuing to break those down into other things. So this is going to be a huge question that I don't think that one lab or one specific group can really answer. This is going to be more not only on a national scale, but even an international scale, because if we can all come together to work on this, I mean, we use plastic everywhere around the world, and
Yeah.
what happens to those after we're done is going to be the big thing. Like I say, is, we're seeing these big garbage patches already in our oceans. I mean, again, walking outside, you see them in our environment on a day-to-day basis. So these are going to be huge areas that we really want to continue to build our own knowledge, as well as help people who aren't necessarily researching this area, but want to be aware of kind of what's going on in the environment and how it's going to affect us. And even at that, not only us, like we've been highlighting, is our kids, our grandkids, our great grandkids, and really the future generation, and how that's going to establish that.
Right, because you said that the plastics found in our bodies were from a really long time ago. And I think that's where we actually started off here, was that you were giving me kind of the history of plastics from the 40s and 50s. And so those are the plastics that we're seeing in in our generation's brains and bodies now,
Correct.
right? That's wild. That's really wild. So once the newness, I guess, or the current zeitgeisty topic of microplastic fades, how do you want the individual, not necessarily the legislator or somebody that works for the government,
Yeah.
how do you want an individual to help keep momentum going forward
You know,
or
I
positive change?
yeah, absolutely. And I think, and I mean, we can't, everybody's going to be make their own ultimate decision, but one thing that I try and incorporate in my life is like, what is my plastic footprint? So how much am I using on a day-to-day basis? How much am I wasting or ending up consuming, and then ultimately ending that I think is going to end up in the landfill? So just trying to think a little bit about that, and like I say, is, there are certain things where plastics do play an important role, but it's also understanding, well, what's going to happen to that single use plastic once I'm done with it. In a lot of ways, many of us don't know where it ends up. We see it enter into a trash, but after that, like, we don't necessarily know what's going to happen to it. So it's making those small daily choices, decisions, and it takes a lot of us or all of us to really start thinking about that as more of a bigger collective
Right.
to really start to see these types of improvements and ultimately like as and I think you hit the topic perfect in saying, this is still microplastics research is still very new and you're hearing all about it. I mean, in the media, not only from our group, but I mean, everywhere. Like there's so many different researchers doing this internationally. We go to our conferences and I feel like every year we see much larger topics being brought up around microplastics. So it's not only from a scientific perspective that we need to think about this, but also a day-to-day perspective and just being more aware of our own use as well as even use on a grander scale from a commercial standpoint, from an independent standpoint, is going to be one area that I think we can all pay attention to and potentially improve. But I mean, like I say, it takes a village to be able to do that, and one person isn't necessarily going to move the needle. So
Right. Yeah, I think there's kind of a sunk cost like fallacy about single-use plastics. If it's already been made, it's already
mm,
sitting in this store.
mhm.
If I don't buy it, somebody else will. So why wouldn't I purchase the thing that's already been made? But I guess that it's supply and demand. If a
Yeah,
couple more people stop buying plastic water bottles at the store, the store won't place as many orders and the company might start making less of them over time. So you never know what kind of ripple effect an individual can have, right?
right, right. And I think that that's also a good point from a consumer perspective and even from uh, like a company perspective. I mean, it is a business at the end of the day, and e- even in a lot of ways, even if they still were to be selling these products, which I mean, it's not to say that they won't or that there's going to be like I don't want anybody to think that I'm giving any bad towards any company for any of that. That's just, it's a consumer world. Those are things that happen. But again, I think that this is where policies or even these waste to energy kind of treatment opportunities can come into play because we can still potentially have these products, but now that we have a bigger infrastructure to be able to better manage them and get rid of them from the environment, I think that that's where that additional knowledge can really come into play. And even in a lot of ways, like from a company perspective, using more recycled materials or taking those single-use plastics and having a way in which they can potentially use those or reestablish them to use them twice or a third time. I think that that's going to be an important thing. And we're seeing a lot of companies that are trying to go that way, but ultimately it is a business and they have to make sure that if they're doing it, every other company should be doing the same thing. So if there's policies in place to kind of level that playing field in a certain way, I think that that's going to be another important area that from a bigger perspective and from the company perspective where they can still be very profitable but also be slightly a little bit more environmentally friendly, if that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. And I've seen that a lot, like micro innovations in like the water button, big water, whether it's the cap size got smaller first. I remember that. Like I really remember the cap size getting smaller actually. And then I was in Europe last summer and all of the caps
They're
stay
not,
attached to the water bottle.
yeah.
That's so cool. And some people are like, oh, it's annoying, but it's just new. It's just new, but that keeps it from getting separated and being broken down more quickly, right? Because it's then an individual tiny piece. Is that the thought behind that?
And it depends on the thickness. I mean, some things may break down faster than others, just depending on the different type of material. But at least, you'll see where all of it's going to stay in one piece together versus like, the cap might fall off or may be thrown away separately from what we're seeing. And then maybe the water bottle might be able to get recycled or used in another way versus, and then that cap just ends up in the environment somehow. So it's just, it's these small decisions. And I mean, there isn't one form fit all. I mean, everything has the goods and the bads, but at least it's being a little bit more aware of how we can potentially keep these as one whole piece. And like I said, is we're still in that area where there's not one right answer, but if we can all come together to figure out what that right answer is, that's going to be very insightful and great for us at the end of the day.
Yeah, it will be. It really will be, I think. So, for my final question, I'm curious. If we fast forward 10 years in your dream scenario, how do you hope that today's studies on microplastics, your work, your research, will have shaped public health guidelines, manufacturing practices, global policy, or even individual decision making?
Yeah. So really, a lot of the research that I'm focusing on is really being able to create a data set or even just a overall mapping of the body, to show exactly one, the mechanisms of how these microplastics are getting into the body, which we have some ideas and some data around, but they're still unpublished. A lot of times, like where we're establishing it is it's from our intake from the GI tract. So as we're eating food, that gets absorbed and then transfers throughout the body into all of our tissues, our vital organs. Learning a little bit more about like what clearance mechanisms we're seeing. I mean, for example,
Clearance.
so how they're being eliminated or getting out of the body. So, like for example, with the Nature Medicine paper, we're also showing that in the kidneys that there is some excretion or that it's actually eliminating it out of the body as well. But to be able to show that how much, and even a big finding within the study was is as we're seeing more plastics in the environment, we're also seeing more plastics in the body as well. So not age dependent. So I mean, somebody who's in their 60s and 70s may not have as much more plastics as say I would have right now, but just because we're seeing that in 20, like for this study, that we were seeing more plastics in 2024 versus what we were seeing back in 2018, that's where it comes, is because as we see more plastics in the environment, it may not be causing any major scenarios or health risks at the time, which we're still uncovering. But at some point, where is it going to do that? Because we always like to say the dose makes the poison.
The
So
dose makes the poison. Okay, basically, just because you're older doesn't mean you've built up more microplastics over time. If we're living in the same era and the same time, and microplastics are higher in our everywhere around us and in our food at this time, we're all taking on more microplastics, increasing the amount of microplastics in everybody's body. So just because I'm older than my 5-year-old doesn't necessarily mean that I have a lot more microplastics in my body than my 5-year-old. As long as we've both been alive in 2025 or 2024, we've got the same load of microplastics essentially.
yeah, and it will vary from person to person. I mean, diet may play a factor into that as well. But yes, it's that concept as there's more in the environment during this time versus like when we were younger. So there's that potential for more exposure to that.
Wow. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you speaking about all of this with me. Obviously, I brought a lot of questions, not only from my own like personal life, but from a lot of my friends as well. This is such a hot topic in science right now and in everyday people's lives.
Mhm.
So it's really useful to have somebody like you who's able to easily and effectively kind of communicate with us about this. So I really appreciate your time.
No, and thank you very much. And I mean, I appreciate you for your willingness to bring me on and really help shed some light on kind of the situation where we're at. Again, by no means do we want to scare people. I mean, we talk about how much is in vital organs, but we also want to allow this for people to have a little bit more of an education on kind of what's going on in the environment and help with their day-to-day decisions. And like I said, this is still such a new area, and that's why with the research that I'm doing, I really want to be able to advance this further, learn the mechanisms of exactly how they're getting into the tissues, where they're staying in our body, how we can clear them, and ultimately if we can figure out ways to better eliminate them out of our bodies or out of the environment. Those are the key areas that we really want to focus on. And again, I think that having individuals like yourself to help shed that light or have that interest, I think is very amazing to see. And again, thank you for this opportunity to discuss. And yeah, well, there's still a lot to uncover, and I'm looking forward to seeing what we can uncover, not only in the next year, the next 5, 10, 15 years. And hopefully together we can all come together and answer a lot of these unknowns, but also help for our future generation as well.
Yes, and generations.
Correct.
Going forward, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garcia. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brinleigh. I appreciate you.
Dr. Garcia, thank you so much for joining us on the Science to People podcast. Your insights on microplastics and whether or not I should get that glass of water picture definitely kept this conversation both understandable and actionable for all of our listeners, and really helped to provide a nuanced look at this kind of complicated and emerging area of research. So for our listeners, if you found this episode helpful, please subscribe, leave a review, share it with somebody who's been curious or concerned about microplastics. We want to get this information out to the people. We'll catch you next time.